Today's featured speaker, backed by popular demand, is Bentley University's senior lecturer, Asbed Kotchikian. Professor Kotchikian is a senior lecturer at the Global Studies Department at Bentley University, where he teaches courses on the Middle East and former Soviet Union. He has written, lectured, presented, and organized conferences on questions of identity and transformation of transnational, diasporic groups, foreign policies of small and weak states, national identity, and regional developments in the Middle East and Eurasia. His book, entitled The Dialects of Small States, Foreign Policymaking in Armenia and Georgia, was published in 2008. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming back Professor Asbed Kotchikian. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Bethany, and the team at Bentley's Office of Alumni and Family Engagement, and for the opportunity to talk about this. I was earlier discussing with both of you about how whenever there's a bad news, last time we were talking about explosion in Lebanon, the harbor, and now talking about war. So I hope I won't be typecast as a bearer or explainer of bad or major issues, bad issues or bad topics. So quickly, just to give you an overview of what I will be talking about is it's a very difficult task to balance between providing the background information, some things that not a lot of people would be aware of, and trying to provide an analysis of the current conflict in general. So I will try my best to balance both of those. I did include, as Emily mentioned, a lot of questions are going to be answered, so earlier submitted questions are going to be answered in my presentation, but I'm sure there will be an opportunity to ask more questions down the line after the presentation. So that being said, just to contextualize the South Caucasus, a lot of people might not be aware of, but it is a region. It's a geographic region, not a political region, sandwiched between or among Russia, Turkey, and Iran, all three major countries. So 3 countries in the region, but also 3 major countries with a big appetite in terms of foreign policy influence in the region and beyond. Also, a basic overview of the 3 sort of belligerents, if you want to call it. I haven't included Turkey, but Turkey is also a belligerent in this conflict, just to get an idea about the overall population, overall size, and ethnic composition. If you look at the second row, I have it in black and red, the population percentage based on 1989, which was the last census ever taken in the Soviet Union, probably the most reliable census ever taken in the last 30 years or so. And in red, the estimates of the current population. And as you can see, in Armenia and Azerbaijan, both countries had a good chunk of an Azerbaijani population in Armenia and Armenian population in Azerbaijan, which doesn't exist anymore, mostly because of the war. Let me quickly go over historical background. The young fellow that you can see at the bottom of the picture of the young fellow is Joseph Stalin. Stalin was his nom de guerre, his revolutionary name. His real name was Joseph Jogaishvili. Mouthful, I know, Georgian by ethnicity. And in 1920, 1921, when the Soviet government, the Bolsheviks, came to power and confirmed, or they asserted their influence and control in Russia, they ended up also occupying or reclaiming their former colonial sort of periphery. This included Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and others, Ukraine, Belarus, and whatnot. He was a commissar. He was an official for nationalities. And this is one of the fascinating things about the Soviet Union at the time, where Soviet communism, Russian Bolsheviks actually advocated what Marx tangentially had mentioned, that ethnicity and nationalism doesn't matter. At the end of the day, they're all going to become the Homo Sovieticus, the evolution of being all Soviet citizens without going through any national, or putting aside nationalities. Yet, the policies that the Soviets implemented was quite fascinating, because in countries like in Georgia, like in Armenia, the Republic of Georgia, not the Peach State, basically they ended up actually decreasing the nationalism. They tried to undermine nationalism, because these 2 groups specifically, they had a long sense of national identity. In other places, like in Central Asia, where they created new entities, and also in Azerbaijan to a lesser extent, they actually advocated for nationalism. So here you have a system of saying, arguing that nationalism doesn't exist, nations don't exist, yet they actually had a double standard in creating identities, national identities, in other cases, diminishing them or marginalizing them. And within this context of nationalities policies, one of the things that Russia or the Moscow at the time decided that they're going to take away land from some groups and create entities within the other. A lot of historians argue that this is an attempt of divide et impera, divide and conquer, basically, where they would create various groups, as you can see here in the map, in the Caucasus. You see in Georgia, for instance, they had Abkhazia, the purple area, South Ossetia, and then in the case of Armenia and Azerbaijan, they created a Nagorno-Karabakh area, which was ethnically majority Armenian, yet it was put under the administrative division of Azerbaijan. By doing so, they actually probably, it was an imperial colonial policy. You dilute the nationalism in both countries, in the case of Armenia. So you suddenly now Azerbaijan has a majority, or not a majority, but a sizable Armenian minority. And more importantly, probably looking long term, this could have been an attempt to foresee what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, meaning sowing the seeds of discontent. So the Soviets are gone, the Soviet authorities are gone, but they have left behind a legacy of conflict or potential conflict between these two countries. Going back to the piece of land, as pictured here, the red area, Nagorno-Karabakh. This was called, Nagorno-Karabakh means black mountain, basically. Basically, this was the area that they created as an administrative unit within Azerbaijan. This area itself, historically, was populated by Armenians, ethnic Armenians. Now, when we say Armenia as a country versus Armenians, you have to be also very careful in terms of making the distinction. You know, Armenia as a state had only appeared in 1991. Starting in 18th century, however, Azeri, as they were known back then as Tatars or Caucasian Tatars and Turks sometimes, they actually also settled in the area. So it is equally important, at least in their mindset, in their historical legacy, that it was a cultural center for them. A lot of writers, a lot of poets, a lot of singers and so on came from that area. So I mentioned this to also emphasize to what important the area is in the mindset of, historically at least, in the mindset of the Azerbaijani populace. I have to also mention here, before going on, that there's always, if you go back enough in time, you can always claim that that land was exclusively yours and exclusively the others and so on. So I'm not going to go into that debate. I'm not going to go into that discussion. I'm just going to be presenting the factual analysis, if you want to call it. Now, the plan that the Azerbaijani, or Nagorno-Karabakh, that area came under Azerbaijani control, in the 70 years or so of Soviet rule, there was a gradual decline of the Armenian population. Some argue because of cultural oppression. A lot of Armenians, ethnic Armenians, left and went to Armenia. At the beginning, for instance, in the 1920s, there was an 88% Armenian population there, ethnic, in the red area that you can see. By 1989, it had dropped to 77%. So that became an alarming situation, or an alarm for the ethnic population. And even under Soviet rule, when the Soviet Union was still in place in the 1960s especially, there were attempts made by the local population requesting the Soviet authorities in Moscow to transfer the Nagorno-Karabakh from Azerbaijani sort of sovereignty within the Soviet Union to Armenian sovereignty. But of course, the Soviets were in no place or in no condition to entertain those requests, because that could have created a precedent. What would allow other countries or other regions in the same situation to not demand the same. And things escalated. Mikhail Gorbachev in 1980s came to power. He had bright ideas of reconstruction, restructuring, liberalization, democratization, At the time, these were all buzzwords, even though no one knew Russian. The words perestroika and glasnost were really big. Even if you type it now in Word, you would identify it as a correct word. It wouldn't underline it as a grammatically grammatically wrong word. So, and that actually motivated ethnic Armenians in Azerbaijan, in Nagorno-Karabakh, to figure out that, okay, since there are reforms, maybe we should ask for reunification again. It was in their purview as an administrative region, semi-autonomous, technically administrative region, to transfer, to vote the local parliament to basically
Asbed, we lost your audio. You're on mute. Just a moment, everyone. Bear with us. You're muted still, but it's 2020.
My apologies. Yes, my apologies. So going back, so the demands for reunification were not welcomed by the Soviet Azerbaijani authorities. Mind you, this is still happening within the Soviet Union. So it is an issue that is going on in at least technically, a federal system, a federal government with divisions within it. So it is all happening within the confines of the Soviet Union. The Soviet authorities actually utilized their internal security forces to basically submit the Armenians, saying that this is not the time for demands of reunification and so on. I'm not going to dwell too much into that, but there were a lot of reports where Soviet internal security forces actually staged a war or staged military sort of activities against the Armenian population there. By 1990, as Moscow was becoming weaker, it had also become more balanced, quote unquote, in its position towards the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. They actually withdrew from it and war raged on. By 1991, when the Soviet Union had collapsed, this war was transferred from an internal Soviet sort of conflict into an international conflict. And it raged on until 1994, when there was a ceasefire agreement. And all of this at the time happened within the creation of a new international world order, if you want to call it. There was an OSCE, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which became the main broker of peace between these countries. And for the last 25, 26 years, this group has tried to find a peaceful solution rather than a military solution for the conflict, with not much sort of results. So this is the overview. And just for you to get an idea as when we talk about the conflict today, as I mentioned, the red area is basically the part which was the autonomous region of Nagorno-Karabakh. And the gray area is territory that the Armenian forces, ethnic Armenian forces, had actually occupied during that time, during the war up until 1994, and de facto have created an unrecognized, a de facto but not a de jure recognized state, with independence, yet not unification with Armenia. I'm not going to go into too much details about this, but the argument has always been there that these are ethnic Armenians who were in Azerbaijan, who fought against oppression as they saw it. And in doing so, they actually occupied the gray area of, literally and figuratively, the gray area around their territory. To make a connection, to have a land connection with Armenia, the republic, but also the thinking, the strategic thinking at the time, up until quite recently, has been that these areas were supposed to be a bargaining chip. These territories are eventually going to be returned to Azerbaijan in return for some kind of a recognition, independence, or union with Armenia. The balance sheet of the conflict is quite painful, has been quite painful for both sides. Up until 1994, because of the conflict, there had been a lot of refugees and IDPs. 600,000 ethnic Azeris were basically evacuated or forced to leave from the occupied territories, but also from Armenia proper. And on the other hand, about 400,000 ethnic Armenians were forced to leave from Azerbaijan themselves. Sometimes, one of the things, if you look at the numbers, people or politicians and propaganda, usually it's good to talk about numbers. They want to have a round number that can be easily presented and so on. Sometimes Azerbaijan says that there have been 1 million refugees without going into detail. Yes, there have been 1 million refugees, but it's not all 1 million have been Azeris. So both sides had refugees moving, population exchange, if you want to call it. And since then, the propaganda and the generational gap. See, back in the Soviet Union, Armenians and Azeris lived with each other in different places. There were neighbors. Armenians had Azeri neighbors, Azeris had Armenians neighbors. So they personalized. They knew what an Armenian was. They knew what an Azerbaijani was. But since then, when there has been limited, since 94, there has been a limited interaction between these. One of the things that took over is the vilification of the other, creating an other which is bad, which is evil, which is devilish, and so on and so forth. And that has continued for the last 25 years or so, even though there have been attempts of creating people-to-people diplomacy to vilify less, but the nationalist rhetoric has been a major issue. Within this context, a couple of people did ask about the question of whether or not there is a legal sort of framework which actually Armenia and Azerbaijan can use. The problem is that there are too many, especially sometimes in the same document. The UN Charter, for instance, Article 1, Section 2, deals with the issue of the right for self-determination. People have the right to determine how they want to live, what kind of a government they want to have, in what context they want to live. At the same time, a couple of articles further down, or one article further down, the UN talks about the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of states. This is the problem of international organization and international law. Armenian side uses the Article 1, Section 2, that Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh wanted to have self-determination. That's what it is all about. Then the Azerbaijani side argues that no, this is a violation of our territorial integrity. And from that perspective, there is no definitive legal sort of argument that you can apply in this case without preferring one over the other. Even the laws are biased, or even the laws can be taken and support different sides. The other issue, legally speaking, and it's a question rather than a fact, that when the Armenian population in Nagorno-Karabakh, citizens of Azerbaijan, they had a local parliament, they voted for secession. They voted for secession when they were still in the Soviet Union. And when Azerbaijan became independent, Nagorno-Karabakh was already not in their hand, was already claimed to be an independent state. So how do you apply this case? It's quite fascinating in modern day, if you look at especially what happened in Catalonia in Spain recently, or the Kurds in Iraq a couple of years ago, when they had a referendum about independence, but then the central authority said, no, this is not legal, and we would not accept any sort of manifestation of that referendum. So there's always that sort of dichotomy, the binary relations between self-determination versus territorial integrity, which fuels the conflict. Add to this, some of the causes, I'm going to move now to have a bit more discussion about the current conflict. What has led to this conflict? Well, for first, both sides have always, they drag their feet in terms of negotiations. There have been arguments, or there have been attempts by OSCE mediators. And when I say the OSCE, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, it specifically for this issue, they have three main countries that are running the show. It's Russia, France, and the US. These three countries have been chairing or co-chairing the process to find a solution. And at the heart of the problem has been the status of the Armenian population in that region. There are a lot of people arguing, for instance, that, and there have been some form of variations, that Armenian forces would return these occupied territories as they would be claimed. Interestingly, by the way, for the longest time, even the Armenian side would claim these as occupied territories rather than liberated territories, because in the mindset, strategically thinking, these were going to be land for peace kind of a deal. Now, the question about how much of this land is going to be returned and so on, the two sides didn't have much difference or much argument on. What mattered is, what will this Nagorno-Karabakh area be? Armenians living there, roughly about 120, 150,000 people. What will their status be? Will they be autonomous within Azerbaijan? And if so, would Azerbaijan provide guarantees, or what guarantees can you provide after 25 years of fighting and so on? The other question would be, or the other option would be, would Azerbaijan accept this area to be completely secede from it and join Armenia? Or it will be sort of like a Kosovo situation where, you know, half the world will recognize it as independent, the other half not, but obviously, none of these were going to be accepted by both sides. The problem, the challenge, was that both sides assumed that time was on their side. The Armenian side thought that they had the upper hand by occupying all this land, and from an Azerbaijani side, from Baku's perspective, it was basically about, you know, it would only take time for them to develop their army, which we've been witnessing now, modernize it, and trying to take over the region militarily. Added to this is the age-old correlation between domestic problems being sort of overshadowed by or being covered by international conflict and so on. The wag, in politics, we call it the wag the dog kind of a situation. And if you've seen the movie many, many years ago, it's about covering a domestic problem by starting a war, fictional or otherwise. But it was clear that Azerbaijan, more so than Armenia, but Armenia also had the challenge of corruption, domestic corruption, poor governance, even after a quarter of a century of independence. And that actually also led each side, especially the Azerbaijani side, to keep the fire burning, the fire of nationalism, the fire of revanchism, revenge, and so on and so forth. Added to this, that Azerbaijan has been under dynastic rule since 1993, 1994. The same family has been in power, and by all accounts, it is not the best example of democratization or democracy. And in order to cover its domestic authoritarianism, they have been obviously raging, or they have been promoting this nationalist, you know, Armenians have occupied, we need to create, we need to act together, we need to stand together to liberate our land. Armenian side, to a lesser extent, because again, keep in mind that here you also have the mentality of a winner and loser kind of a thing, you know, at a war, up until at least recently, that the Armenians were on the winning side, or they viewed themselves as winners. So why bother, push forward negotiations? But in 2008, when Armenia went through a revolution, a peaceful revolution that changed the regime, and by many accounts, it was the beginning of a democratization attempt. So I want to emphasize these two. Probably many observers, especially in Azerbaijan, thought that this could be a new beginning. We could reset the relations, we could reset the negotiations, but at the same time, they were afraid of it, the Azerbaijani authorities. I think to a large extent, this authoritarianism, democracy dichotomy did have something to play, a role to play in the escalation of the recent conflict. Not only, but some explanation. Of course, the Armenian authorities continued their policy, you know, looking at it from the position of strength, that we have the land anyway, we're not gonna budge in, we're not gonna compromise. And eventually this has led to the escalation as we see today. It escalated into an all-out war for the past month or so. What are some of the key things, in my opinion? A couple of factors sort of overlap that allow this conflict to escalate. First of all, COVID-19, the pandemic, I think, diverted a lot of attention internationally from conflict areas, from hotspots and so on. If you remember, at the end of 2019, there was mass demonstrations in Hong Kong. There were demonstrations in Lebanon for social and whatnot issues, political issues. Suddenly, with COVID-19, when the world was not paying attention or not paying enough attention on these, local governments and authorities managed to disperse these or to suppress these movements. So usually, I think timing is very, very important. Consider the pandemic shifted attention of the global community, especially peacekeeping community, if you want to call it, or peace-seeking community from this. The second thing, and I think this is quite problematic and relates directly to U.S. And Western, but specifically U.S. foreign policy in the last couple of years. When people pay more attention about whether president's tax returns are where and how much he paid taxes and so on, rather than focusing on international affairs, and this has been going on even before the tax issues and so on and so forth. But the United States has been in a cycle of isolationism in recent years, a fact that actually gave an opportunity for other countries, including Turkey, and to a lesser extent Russia, to expand, to flex their muscles regionally. This is probably a failure of a U.S. Foreign policy in general. Now, a lot of people would argue that the U.S. is not the policeman of the world and so on and so forth. But whether we like it or not, the U.S. is a major presence, domestic, globally speaking, diplomatic on the global scale, and its policies or lack of can have serious repercussions. Now, I do not want to allocate any percentage to any of these. I think it's the congruence of all of these together that led to this latest escalation of conflict. The third thing that is important is that Russia's view of the region that used to be part of the Soviet Union. The Russians have an interesting term. They call it the near abroad. They say, yeah, this is not part of Russia anymore, but they used to be part of the Soviet Union. And thus, we consider them to be the near abroad. And that includes Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, and other countries as well that were part of it. And they would look at any attempt by the West or even by these countries to break away from their orbit as something that is of vital interest. For those of you who are familiar with American politics, it's the same concept as the Monroe Doctrine by President Monroe back in the 19th century, where he claimed that the Western Hemisphere is hands-off for anyone but the United States, basically. And the Russians have the similar perspective. They had been engaged in creating or strengthening or supporting their allies in Syria, for instance, and other places. But here, I haven't included it here, but they also had a policy back from the 1990s called the Primakov Doctrine. Primakov was a former prime minister and a foreign minister of Russia. And his doctrine, we always like to put these doctrines. It wasn't anything written like the Primakov Doctrine with a document and so on, but it was an articulation of a mind or a perspective. Primakov argued that in a back then, in a unipolar world where the United States is the only standing superpower, Russia should find ways, allies, to create resistance or to stand up against American expansion in different parts. Those partners could be China, could be Iran, and anyone else for that matter. So with U.S. weakening or the U.S. disengaging from world affairs to a large extent, and I might understand that there are people who would say, well, look at what the United States is doing in other places, in the Middle East specifically and so on. I don't consider that as an engagement. I think those are, very low-hanging fruits that that might have even fallen. The United States just happened to catch it or shake the tree for them to fall rather than actively creating involvement and creating peace and other initiatives. So we have COVID, we have Western in general disengagement, Russian constant interest in its backyard, and the main factor, I think, which pushed this is Turkey. Turkey, in the last 15 years or so, has become a major player, has been flexing its muscle to a large extent, especially under its current president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Turkey has used itself as a major player in the region and beyond. It is, I mean, it used to be to a large extent in the top 20, it is in the top 25 economies in the world. It has a very strong army. It is a NATO ally. However, in the last decade or so, we've witnessed that the president of Turkey has been calculating, has been planning, moving the chess pieces around so that it could have a larger role, global, not only regionally, but globally as well. This manifested itself, started manifesting itself back in 2010 and 11, when there was a war in Syria, the civil war. Turkey became a direct sort of part of the conflict by arming and providing opportunities for opponents of the Assad regime, the president of Syria. It had been involved in Iraq, especially in the north, by fighting with and sometimes cooperating with Kurdish autonomous governments there. Has been engaged in northern Cyprus since 1974. Turkey in 1974 invaded and occupied northern Cyprus and established a country that no one else but Turkey recognizes. But quite interestingly, it has actually outreached itself to go to even to Libya, where there has been a civil war raging as well, and Turkey decided to take sides with one of the belligerents there. More recently, there have been escalation between Greece and Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. Some people argue it's about energy, submarine, subwater energy sources. So you can see has been expanding its muscles quite wide. It's opening its scope quite wide. And this actually, when talking with Turkish colleagues of mine, the other day, we were joking that Turkey, when it was established, it had a mantra. It says, peace abroad, peace at home, peace abroad, and zero problems with neighbors. In the last 10 years, actually, what happened is that both of these mantras are becoming irrelevant because Turkey has a major problem domestically against the Kurds. It has involved in countries or regions around it. And also, it has problem with almost all of its neighbors at this point. The reason why I wanted to contextualize this is that also to realize that Turkey and Azerbaijan have been very close allies. They are very close allies because of strategic interest. Some argue because of ethnic similarities. President Erdogan has always argued that Turkey and Azerbaijan are two nations, or one nation in two states. But they actually have been cooperating militarily, not so much as economically. I think Azerbaijan exports more, but more importantly, because of oil, energy. Azerbaijan is a producer of oil and gas. And in the last 20 years or so, the question was how to get that oil from Azerbaijan to the West, bypassing Russia. And from that perspective, as you can see, the two pipelines here, three pipelines. One goes to the Black Sea via Georgia, but the two other main pipelines, one is oil, the other one is gas, bypass Armenia and go to Turkey, and from Turkey all the way to the Mediterranean port of Ceyhan. So they are important. It's not about oil. Nothing is about oil. Nothing is about religion. By the way, this is also the mantra or the analysis, simple analysis, that this is about a religious war. Armenia happens to be Christian. Azerbaijan happens to be Muslim. I always tell my students that countries don't fight over religion. Even the Crusaders was not a religious war. It was about economically driven under the guise of religion. So this is not about religion. This is not about democracy versus authoritarianism, although that plays a small factor. This is about territory, and territory manifesting itself in the form of a pride that you belong to. And within this context, considering all of this, Turkey's neo-Ottomanism, if you want to call it, expansionism, and Turkey can afford to do that, right? Turkey is a NATO country, is a member of NATO, but at the same time, it has established good relations with Russia. In recent years, it has bought a lot of missiles and a lot of weapons from Russia. Even when at some point they came head conflict, when Turkey actually downed a Russian jet in Syria, within 6 months, everyone said, oh, this is going to lead to a war between the two. But within 6-7 months, it was hush-hush, and they became buddies again. What I'm trying to explain here is that, or trying to convey here, is that at some point when Turkey has witnessed also that it is time for it to also expand its influence on Azerbaijan and Armenia by directly supporting Azerbaijan. So after 25 years of attempts for peaceful negotiation, Azerbaijan, with the help of Turkey, extensive help of Turkey, militarily speaking, they started the war. They reignited the war about a month ago. It's too early to talk about what's going to happen. With this age of social media, as much as there is disinformation out there, it becomes even more and more difficult about the official statements and the game plan of what Turkey's game plan is, what Russia's game plan is, and so on. It is suffice to say that the West is irrelevant overall. The United States and Europe has become irrelevant in this. Recently, Mike Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State, brokered a ceasefire agreement which lasted for all 45 minutes, which is longer than the other previous two that have been in place in the last couple of weeks. So Turkish involvement in this has been also planned. It could also fall under the larger sort of plan or larger appetite of Turkey being a major regional player. And again, I'm not going to go into details as to what is happening on the ground. According to some reports, the Azerbaijani army has been able to advance on the southern front and liberate some of their territory and so on. I think it would be redundant to talk about these details. They say the devil is in details. And in the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, right? Small minds talk about things, issues, numbers, details. Medium minds talk about people, and great minds talk about ideas. So this is, I'm not saying that I have a great mind. It's just an attempt to go beyond the day-to-day sort of analysis of what force was used, what rocket was used, and so on. Suffice it to say, this is a tragedy, humanitarian tragedy, not only in terms of the soldiers that have been killed so far on both sides. That's the sad thing, even more than that. These truce attempts were made to collect the bodies, but they haven't been able to do that. No one respected this. The truce, the Azerbaijani side kept attacking, probably because they're advancing. Why stop now? By some accounts, over 5,000 soldiers have died on both sides. Countless civilians have been killed as well. And all of this while probably Russia and Turkey specifically, and Iran to a less extent. I don't want to dwell too much on Iran, but Iran is a regional player and is basically keeping an eye on these developments to try to see what can it do and how can it preserve the balance. I try to, give you an overview in 40 minutes. It's impossible. I tried to balance between the background and the current issues as well. But I hope this provides some insight and raises some questions, hopefully, in your mind that you can basically pursue or follow up on your own or during the questions if there are any. Thank you for your attention. And I guess at this point, the floor is yours, Emily.
Thank you, Asbed. That's really helpful. We did have one question here about the other area in orange on the map that you're currently displaying. Is that also part of Azerbaijan?
Yes, it is part of Azerbaijan, and it's fascinating. This is the absurdity of the Soviet nationalities policies. So they took away an Armenian-populated land and encircled it, made it an enclave in Azerbaijan, but they also took this area, which had in 1920, had about 40% Armenian population, and they gave it to Azerbaijan as well. So this is an exclave of Azerbaijan. And actually, to what extent, I haven't explored this, but at some point, this actually area gives tiny bitty border with Turkey, as you can see here. And some people argue that Turkey actually had land exchange with Iran so that they can have access to this Azerbaijani sort of exclave. Again, maps are drawn, if you look around, especially the Middle East, the former Soviet Union, maps are drawn by the great powers without consideration whatsoever about self-determination or any kind of an interest in the repercussions that they might have.
Wonderful, thank you. There were some questions around what, what as the average American is a way to engage with thinking about this beyond perhaps learning some of this background historical context?
Well, first of all, learning about the world is always a good thing. But you have to also realize what I argued about the causes of the war, why the war now can also make it difficult for an average American to follow these news. We have concerns, economic concerns here, whether or not I will have a job, COVID-19, elections, US elections, and so on. But being informed, the problem is the US media in general is very US centric and very limited internationally. I think one of the things is about self-reflection. I don't think there is any tangible value about being informed about this, but it has a sort of conceptual, intellectual value to understand what's happening in the world and the repercussions of what could happen if the US is not there. Is there a moral responsibility that the US has to have? Putting aside morality is pushed aside in international conflict. Politics, who cares about morality? But I think there is a large Armenian population living in different parts of the United States. So they have been educating, quote unquote, their neighbors, their colleagues, and so on and so forth. There's also, of course, Azerbaijani and Turkish presence to present these issues. The challenge is whom to believe. The challenge is what can you do? The what can you do part, honestly, I do not see anything sitting here that we can do to help this. It is a war raging, and unfortunately, from what I see, it's not going to have a compromisable sort of situation. I know I'm going on tangents, and I'm, talking about, without actually philosophizing rather than giving a concrete example. But I think at the end of the day, it's about knowledge. It's about information. It's about choosing what matters in the overall, but also understanding the limits that you have in your current life, in your daily life now.
In a segue, talking about repercussions, there were several pre-submitted questions about how would this potentially impact the US's relationship with Turkey. Can you provide any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure from the US perspective, but Turkey, I think at this point, especially in the last 5-6 years, has actually distanced or doesn't care much about what the US thinks. When Turkey was going to purchase surface-to-air missiles from Russia, the United States, the Secretary of Defense, the Pentagon, expressed concerns that you are a NATO ally. You have American weapons. Why are you buying Russian weapons? It sort of doesn't make much sense. Turkey said, go basically, don't deal with me. I don't care what you think. US relations, the U.S.-Turkish relations, I think they're overall already at their low. And this is one of the other things, by the way. Turkey and Russia, they share something other than, their involvement in this, is that they both share their disdain towards the U.S. and the West in general. So in some ways, they are actually on the same side while not being on the same side. So I think Turkey, from this perspective, Turkey feels comfortable that the U.S. won't be able to do anything, that the U.S. is not interested in doing anything. And the U.S. is not going to take action to basically suspend Turkey from NATO. I think, again, it's a manifestation of U.S. Non-interventionist, isolationist foreign policy. That will leave Turkey do whatever it wants for its own interest, at least from the way they see it, without actually worrying about repercussions from the U.S.
All right, we have time for one more question. This question says, since this is taking place in Russia's backyard, if there's no agreement for both sides to cease fire and begin negotiations, do you think Russia will be forced to take military action?
The short answer is no. Usually Russia tried twice to come up with a humanitarian truce, which both of them weren't respected. But I think when it comes to military presence, it's all about timing. Listen, a month ago, had there been an agreement, had both sides, Azerbaijan and Armenia, said, okay, let's sit down and hash this out with the current situation, what we need to do. Armenia would have been giving up a large part of these territories here, the gray area, and then they would actually, the status here, temporary status of the red area, Armenian-populated area, with security guarantees, which would probably be Russian troops on the ground. But now that Azerbaijan is on the advance, is taking land, liberating the land that Armenia was supposed to give back for negotiations, Russia doesn't have any reason or any pretext to intervene, right? Because technically speaking, this is happening within Azerbaijan. And if Azerbaijan says, you know, I don't want Russian troops to be here, Russia would not. Although Russia does have a bilateral agreement with Armenia to protect its outside borders. So there are Russian troops who are in charge of Armenia's borders. And Russia might bring troops to basically put them on the border here if all this area is gone, and hence they will have a stronger, they would have a stronghold on Armenia, a stronger stronghold on Armenia. But at the same time, just thinking out loud, I think Russia's non-intervention might be also viewed favorably by Azerbaijan, because Russia, as the question mentioned, they could have intervened and stopped this, but they're not doing so. Sometimes non-intervention in its way could be beneficial to one side or the other. So they can actually have this approach that you guys owe me one because I didn't intervene. So, you know, I let you do your thing. But you know, what does that translate into? It's quite problematic. And I am very, very careful, as I mentioned earlier, Emily, that the things are changing so fast on the ground, and there are so many pieces that one cannot see, especially with Russia and Turkey. I think they're both having a very long-term chess game, and they have 7-8 pieces ahead. They're thinking 7-8 pieces ahead. And they're doing it very well in terms of hiding it very well. So it's quite difficult. It's much easier, and everyone would say, of course, it's easier to do it in retrospect, to analyze that. But as of now, it's just about how long the fighting will go on. Is it going to last, or is it going to continue until the weather gets cold and the table might turn, the Armenians might start counterattacks, or is it going to be protracted war? It's going to continue longer. So many questions that a military expert might be better in explaining. But again, so many pieces, so many factors that it becomes quite difficult. The only thing I would recommend, as I'm doing now, is understanding the background. It's to just watch and observe what's happening and try to make the connections. And there are more than one connections there.
Well, thank you so much. I know we were joking earlier that we only have you on for these very heavy topics, very depressing topics. So hopefully the next time we have you back, it'll be for something a little more positive and uplifting. But thank you to everybody who joined us today. As you mentioned, we will send out the recording to those of you who attended today. We thank you for your time and have a great afternoon.